Thanks for joining us. Welcome back for another episode of Consumer Guide to Property Damage. Today we have the awesome Matt Mulholland with us, Mathew Mulholland. He is with National Claims Institute and also has an awesome podcast that you have to check out. I'm going to let him tell you all about that. Matt, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. So first of all, tell us a little bit about what you do and just tell us about Mathew Mulholland.
Oh, you don't want the second part so much.
It's okay.
So I'm an educator in the insurance world. We teach claims handling at the National Claims Institute to everyone that's involved in it. Contractors, public adjusters, even insurance adjusters, attorneys, and engineers. Podcast is a lot more fun. So we have a podcast called Listen to This Bull. That's what the bullhead is about. And we talk about bullshit in the insurance world. Can I curse during this? I should have asked beforehand.
I think it's probably okay. I don't know that our consumers are going to be too young.
Yeah.
We should probably tone it down just so that it.
Right.
Yes, but I think one S-bomb is
All right,
probably
I'll
okay.
see what I can do.
You'll try, right?
No promises. It's okay. So, Matt, thanks for being here. We wanted to talk a little bit today around a public adjusting in general. What is a public adjuster? How are they trained? Why would a consumer need one? How do they find one? All of those things.
Okay. Well, I am a public adjuster. Had a company in Georgia. At the time, it was the largest PA firm in Georgia. We about 3,000 claims a year, which I'm not practicing as a PA at the moment because of the school taking up all of my time. But public adjusters are an interesting concept. Just so the audience is aware of what one is, you've got different adjusters. I think everybody could picture in their minds what an insurance adjuster is. You've got an insurance adjuster. He's going to come out, take a look at your property, evaluate what's going on the property, tell you if there's any damages that are covered and how much that's worth, and write you a check, supposedly. You can picture one in your head right now. You're picturing someone with a really nice, crisp polo shirt, possibly a light blue button down with khakis on, holding a clipboard, looking up. That's what everybody
Typical
pictures.
Commercial.
Because of commercials, right? So you have your insurance adjuster. The insurance adjuster is working for the insurance company. They are required by law in many states to look out for the best interest of the insurance company.
And not the policyholder?
Policyholder's best interest and the insurance company's best interest they're in direct conflict. Mm-hmm. The insurance companies are for-profit companies, generally. There's exceptions to everything that I'm saying, and I'm not a lawyer. And other disclaimers.
So many
disclaimers work that easily. And other things. That encompasses all of it. So the policyholder, it's in their best interest to get as much money as possible to make as good a repair as possible to their property. And the insurance company, being a for-profit company, it's in their best interest to pay out as little as possible. So there is a direct conflict there. So having an insurance adjuster come out from the company that has conflicting interests to the policyholder can lead to some problematic scenarios. So that's where the public adjuster comes in. A public adjuster works directly for the policyholder. They can't get hired by insurance companies at all. At least not for that claim. They might have dual licenses, but they can't be on the same claim. So a public adjuster works only for the policyholder and is required by law to look out for the best interests of the policyholder, even above their own interests.
Okay.
So you have your own adjuster that's going out and performing roughly the same job, maybe a little bit more detailed, maybe not, depends on how good an adjuster the insurance company sends you, and put together how much they think the value of that loss is, and then negotiate that.
So why can't a contractor do that? Because a contractor would be able to go out and do an inspection and, understand the work that needs to be performed on that job.
Have the homeowner's best interest in mind.
Yeah. Why would?
Well, there is a difference there. So if a public adjuster is going to negotiate on your behalf or represent you on the claim, they're going to be talking about dollars and cents that is owned by the policyholder. The benefits of this contract is going to go to this policyholder. if a contractor were trying to negotiate those dollars and cents and come to some kind of an agreement. They're acting in a fiduciary responsibility to that policyholder. And when you're doing that kind of a thing, it requires a license, according to most states.
It's that fiduciary that makes that license requirement.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to accidentally say something as a contractor that made the coverages disappear, anything that might happen, they don't have any kind of a errors and omissions policy for that. They don't have any training to talk about policy language. Let's take a step back though and just talk about the fact that there are coverages in policies that a public adjuster might be aware of and want to gain for the policyholder that the contractor wouldn't care about because they're not going to do any work on that portion of it.
Mm-hmm. So it's not just inspecting and coming up with the price. You're also talking about policy and understanding the consumer's policy.
I mean, public adjusters need to work with contractors. So getting a public adjuster involved isn't deciding not to use a contractor. It's deciding to use a professional that understands how policy is supposed to work.
Got it.
And make sure that the insurance company is going to treat you fairly based on that policy language.
And I think that that's fair, and I think it's even more fair to say that most consumers don't know what's in their policy.
Oh, yeah.
And, that's part of the reason that we're doing this, but, to try to help educate.
I think most people in general, not even the adjusters, sometimes know what's in the policy.
That's probably
That's
a fair
fair
statement
assessment.
too. But, I agree. I think, policies are so complex and they're 60 to 70 pages and it becomes almost overwhelming for
Yeah.
people to need to sit down and read and understand. And there's words in there like
That are
what
scary,
I thought
frankly.
said pearl for a really long time for some reason.
You thought it said what?
Pearl.
Oh, for peril?
Yeah, right? And so I
This
can't.
is why you don't have a contractor.
That's exactly why. And I'm okay
This is why
doing it.
contractors have to stay in their lane.
Yeah.
It's a covered pearl. I'm telling you.
You know the kind you get from an oyster?
But, anyways, as I'm saying, I think that consumers would look through things and it just becomes overwhelming.
It is.
And I do firmly believe that there are times when you have to have an expert step in. And, Crystal and I have said this a lot of times, the reason we're bringing people like yourself on or, attorneys or other people is because we can't legally talk about the things that you can talk about. It violates a variety of different laws. We could be interpreting something incorrectly because we are not trained in policy. And that's the last thing that we want to do. So let's get back to what you were saying. At what point does a consumer need the services of a public adjuster?
Well, that's hard to tell.
Well, what would your best advice be to a consumer?
Right. So you
Does
don't
everybody
need-
always
you shouldn't,
need one?
let's say you shouldn't. You shouldn't need a public adjuster at all. The point of the insurance policy is you've got all of this stuff that's covered. It's supposed to be written in plain language, so anybody should be able to interpret that. It should have one meaning, and you should have this list of what you're supposed to do in the event of the loss, which is in there, but it's buried, and it's confusing in the wording that it is, and it's asking you to turn in things as if you should know what a proof of loss is. All of that should be something that a policyholder is capable of performing to gain the benefits of their policy without the use of a professional. But unfortunately, policies aren't really written in plain language. They're written in legalese. The lack of a comma at some time in the policy or a missing semicolon can change the entire meaning. There are terms in there that are used seemingly against people just because the layman definition of this term means something completely different than the way it was meant to be defined in the policy, but they don't define it in the policy. And that lack of a definition leads to a lot of misinterpretation, misunderstanding, possibly purposefully.
Right.
So there does need to be someone involved, unfortunately, in a lot of cases. And sometimes that someone is good enough if it's a contractor. If it's a simple loss, a contractor generally, I mean, they've been doing this long enough. If they could just give some, hey, this is what in my experience happens, and then the policyholder can then take that little bit of information, read their own policy and do it, they might be able to get away without using a public adjuster. But it all takes time and a hell of a learning curve to get through something like that. So I think that today, more than ever before, public adjusters are almost necessary on a case-by-case, almost every case, just because the policies are so complex. The length of these policies has tripled in the last 10, 15 years. It's crazy.
It is. And so I guess in your opinion, Matt, would you say there's any kind of a, minimum claim size, or just a, claims complexity? Is there anything like that you would say to a consumer, you should 100% ban, your first call should be to a public adjuster? Does any of that matter?
I don't think there's a rule of thumb for this, unfortunately.
Okay, and that's fair.
And in some states, you can't even get one because they're not even licensed. Most of the
Kansas,
states
I
that
think
start
you
with
can.
A,
I think
Arkansas,
Kansas,
Alabama.
Yeah.
Some of these states don't even have them. And in some states, a public adjuster doesn't have the same authority as in other states where they can even negotiate on your behalf. The only thing they might be able to do is compile information for you. So there isn't a good rule of thumb that would be applied nationwide. I can tell you, for most, if it's a commercial loss, I would recommend getting a professional involved. But a public adjuster, I think, is probably the first choice that I would go with. But I'm biased because I'm a public adjuster. An attorney might also be another choice to go with. But if you are dealing with a good adjuster that is actually trying to do their best to help you out, you might not need one at all. So sometimes it's hard to tell. If you feel like you don't want to handle any additional stress in your life, maybe getting a public adjuster is a good idea.
It's a great point.
Yeah, that is a great point. And typically from a fee standpoint, or who pays for the public adjuster, like where does that come from?
So that's a good question. For most states, public adjuster's fees is added on top of the deductible, basically. Homeowner is going to pay out deductible to contractors that are going to be performing the work. Whatever the public adjuster's fees is professional fees that they will end up having to pay out of pocket for some states. In other states, those professional fees may be able to come out of or be added on to the amount of loss. It depends on what the policies say and if there's any case law or statutes in those states. In some states, this is the problem. Every state is completely different on these laws for all insurance, anything.
And we've
All
talked
right?
about that
I'm
it's
glad.
really important to talk to an attorney in your state or a public adjuster in your state to find what is applicable to you. And
Sure.
that hasn't changed. And, Matt's giving very general statements and, some here, some there, just so that you understand it's not all the same. And I think that that's what's the most important part here, is that it is different. It is a state by state. I mean, we talked with Chip Merlin earlier, and specifically about that and what it looks like from an indemnification. Some states have time restraints that hold the insurance company accountable. Some states are more pro-consumer. Some states are not pro-consumer. And so again, we understand that this is very, very general, and it's very important that if you have questions about what your specific state's laws or regulations are, you need to talk to somebody that's licensed to talk to you about that in your state.
Yeah. Yes. And finding those individuals that know those states can sometimes be a chore as well. If you're looking for some good advice, if the state that you're in has an organization that ends in APIA, Georgia, for example, we had a GAPIA for the Georgia Association of Public Insurance Adjusters. It was an organization of insurance or public adjusters, but we also had property damage attorneys, plaintiff attorneys that would also be willing to explain to you how that state works.
And now NAPIA is the national.
NAPIA is a national one. You can reach
So
out
that
to
would,
them.
they could probably
There's
reach
a
out there.
TAPIA, FAPIA, CAPIA, a MAPIA. There's a lot of APIAs out there, so you might be able to find one of those in your state to help out.
But it is a licensed position, so if your state has a licensing division, you might be able to look something up on a state website.
Yeah, I mean, they're not going to be real plain language there either on exactly what is going to happen. You know,
No, but
even-
they could find a professional
find a
based on a
professional,
license
sure.
lookup.
And I think the other issue is if you've already talked to a contractor that you trust, right? You found somebody and you've already talked to them, you know, even though they can't talk to you about the policy or even really help you interpret that, most of them have somebody that they would refer you to, wouldn't you think, Matt?
And if they don't, they should.
Yeah, that
And I
would be-
teach
that would be a
contractors this all the
reflect.
time. And this is the hard part because there's not enough public adjusters out there. So finding a PA for every claim is not a possibility. As much as I think it might be necessary because of the way policies are written, it's not a reality. So finding a contractor that will, you know, discuss their bid, discuss how much what the work entails, and all those kinds of things on your behalf to the carrier is great. If it ends up becoming a coverage argument or an issue that involves policy language argument, then most contractors should have some kind of a public adjuster or an attorney that they can refer you to, because at that point, you definitely need one. You might have needed one before, but you definitely need one if you've got denial on what should be covered damages, or they're just saying no to certain things that don't add up in the policy. And there's a lot of that. You can find a lot of those things on Listen to This Bull.
Absolutely.
Oh, Matt, you're always so much fun to sit around and talk to. What are some things that should alert a consumer with a public adjuster if they were doing something that was not in the consumer's best interest or committing some type of fraud or something along those lines? Because, you know, we had, you know, Doug Quinn from the APA, and we talked about insurer fraud. We had, you know, Jason Reishman here, and we talked about contractor fraud, and we realize that fraud exists everywhere because humans are everywhere, and there are bad humans in all.
So
in all
public
jobs.
adjuster fraud is what you want to know about.
Well, how do they identify it? Like, what would be some triggers that something might not be right here?
This will be harder to tell, probably.
Oh, that would be my assumption, and part of that's my own curiosity.
Yeah, so, and again, it's a state-specific thing, so I'm going to give you some examples, but it might not be an issue in other states. But in many states, at least, a public adjuster contract has to be very, very specific, and it has to have specific wording. If you have a public adjuster that doesn't have a contract with you, the insured, then I would be skeptical of something weird going on. If you have a contractor that's saying, I'm a public adjuster, don't worry, but they don't have a public adjuster contract with you, there's probably something weird going on.
I think there's only 1 or 2 states where a contractor can be a public adjuster at the same time.
It's actually probably a lot more than you think.
Oh, really?
And whether or not it is written in there that you can do it, there are many states that it just doesn't say that you can't.
Oh.
And because of that, it's a bit ambiguous. So as far as I'm aware, there's about 13, maybe it's 12 now, but they're slowly being eliminated. But if you're in a state like Illinois, you can be a contractor and a public adjuster on the same claim. You can be the contractor and also be a licensed public adjuster representing the insured. For most states, that is considered a conflict of interest because a public adjuster that is also the contractor would only be working to gain those benefits for their own contracting firm. But I still think it's better in that regard than not having a PA involved at all, because that PA is still possibly going to get benefits or gain some kind of a fee for getting you the benefits outside of
some
what the
kind of
contractor is doing.
financial incentive.
Right. You know, if a contractor is going to be doing your roof or your siding, they're not going to care so much about your personal property items. So they're probably not going to help you with that. They're not going to care as much about whether or not you can go live outside the home with additional living expenses. They're definitely not going to care if you have any loss of rents or something in a rental property. Or
loss of use if your business is in the house
Yes.
or, okay.
So they don't have any interest in that, so why would they go down those paths? They might not even bring it up to you. It's almost like having an insurance adjuster not tell you that there's additional living expense benefits that they're supposed to tell you about, but if they don't tell you, it's because well, I don't want to say what their reasoning is.
They forgot.
Yeah, they totally just forgot about it. I have some stories on that, but
So let me ask you a
no
question.
incentive.
You brought up a point, and I will say in my own contracting business, I recently came across a situation where the insurance carrier sent an insurance adjuster out to do their own inspection, as a normal part of the process.
Mm-hmm.
They sent them out to do an inspection on the policyholder's home. The contractor or the insurance adjuster that was sent, the carrier's adjuster that was sent, made the statement that he is an insurance adjuster he obviously must be some type of an independent adjuster because he doesn't work for just one company. He said he was an insurance adjuster, a public adjuster, and a contractor, and he made a very weird statement. I would just love to get your opinion on this because homeowners may hear some of these types of things from adjusters, and it's, I'd like somebody to know whether that's something to have a red flag about. And so his statement after stating all of those three things were that he likes to push some claims aside to come back and get later because he is a restoration contractor. Matt, is that an okay thing to do?
No.
Okay.
Oh, no. All right, so being a public adjuster and an insurance adjuster and a contractor is not necessarily illegal. There are some states where you can't hold both licenses for an insurance adjuster, independent adjuster, and a public adjuster, but many states you can. You just can't be all of those things on the same claim. You can be only one of those. So if the insurance company sent him out that he was acting as the independent adjuster, he can't act as the contractor.
So
he
he
can't
can
act
only
as the
wear
public
one
adjuster.
hat at a time.
He's got one hat, and if he's going to game that system in order to come back and gain business for his contracting firm, then he's acting in the best interest of his contracting firm,
And
not in
not-
the policyholder's best interest, definitely not in the insurance company's best interest, and it's definitely violating the
licensing agreement.
licensing
yeah.
agreement.
Okay.
And in that kind of a situation, I think that, we've talked about where do consumers go for various things, and that would be a license complaint. And, because professionally licensed people need their license to be able to continue to operate. And so licensing complaints are very powerful, whether it's a contractor license complaint, whether it's an attorney license complaint, an engineer license complaint, or a public adjuster license complaint. That is something that you as a consumer have the right to know and have the right to take action on should you so feel you need to. So what, if I was interviewing a public adjuster, what would be some...
You are.
That is actually very true. He is right. Let me clarify.
If I was a consumer.
This is Matt Mulholland that we're talking to here. If I was interviewing a public adjuster to represent me or assist me with my claim, what would be some important questions that I should ask from a vetting standpoint to know whether or not I have an experienced enough public adjuster or the right type? Are there different types of public adjusters?
So if you're gonna kind of vet a public adjuster out, you could ask them how long they've been a public adjuster. There aren't any real different types of public adjusters, but there are public adjusters that specialize in things, kind of like attorneys that specialize in divorce or property losses. So you could ask a public adjuster what kind of claims they generally take on, or what type of claims they take on more than any other type of claim. For a lot of public adjusters, there might be some that specialize in residential or roof claims, or some that specialize in fire. So if you've got a fire loss and you've got a residential roof claims specialist public adjuster, might be the first time they're handling a fire claim.
They may not know what things to look
They
for.
might not know. And there's so much that a public adjuster needs to know.
We were educated earlier, and I didn't know this, but I didn't know that attorneys can't have a specialty. They can have a type of law that they practice, but they can't advertise that as a specialty. which I thought was really interesting.
What's the difference?
Would that be the same with public adjusters?
So I wasn't aware about that either.
Yeah.
So I mean, if what I meant by specialty, maybe that's a term for something that
I
I'm not
don't
aware of.
know. I thought it was interesting. I should have asked
Yeah.
Chip to clarify that, and I may have to because I've never heard that before. But it may be advantageous to you guys as consumers and all of us as consumers to ask what type of experience their practices in, or what type of claims they have experience in case there are places that have similar laws or similar rules.
Yeah, who knows?
And I don't know either, but I just want to be respectful of those if that is something. So
That's a good disclaimer.
yes, I got you.
All right. But yeah, totally ask them if they specialize in something, because I don't think that's a terrible term. If they generally handle this kind of claim, then they barely ever handle this kind of claim. If this is the kind of claim you have, then
Makes common sense that
right, you'd want to find someone that handles this regularly,
Yeah.
so that it's a smoother process. It'll probably transpire faster. The kind of adjusters that you meet on one kind of loss versus another are different. So if this is someone that regularly does fire losses, they're going to meet with fire type adjusters from the carrier side, and they're going to know all the different cause and origin
They're gonna speak the
experts
same
that are sent
language,
out.
right? Yeah.
They speak the same language, but they probably even know these individuals and have a relationship with them already, which makes the process a lot better. So if you've got a odd type of loss, if it's not just like a roof claim, if you've got something major going on, you probably need someone that kind of specializes in that, even if that isn't the right term to use. So business
maybe that
interruption.
might mean they had like
Yeah.
you said, a fire, or it could be that they had a substantial leak in their house and they might suspect that there's mold or
Yeah.
something like
Well,
that.
flood's a whole different thing.
right.
Floods are great.
Yep.
That's a perfect example because it's a completely different kind of policy. It's a separate policy from your homeowners or your business policy. So
And there's like very specific requirements that have to be
NFIP
done.
has some
Yep.
fun stuff in there,
Yeah.
and it's very strict, and very by the book. But yeah, no, ask them for their experience on the type of loss that you have, and if you can get references, that would be ideal. The contract that they're going to put in front of you, you're not really going to know much about what's in that, but understand that if you do a little bit of due diligence beforehand to find out if the public adjusters have to have a specific type of contract in your state, then you can verify if it actually matches up with that, so you don't get any kind of red flags there. That's next level interviewing of a public adjuster though, right?
So we've talked a little bit about direction to pay, assignment of benefits, and contract. So as far as the relationship with a public adjuster,
So for most states, a public adjuster can become a
payee,
payee on the check. And for most states, you may even allow the public adjuster to deposit that check into an escrow account, non-interest bearing escrow account, and possibly make disbursements to the contractors and different things for you. In many states, you're even allowed to give the public adjuster a power of attorney to sign off on the check for you if you choose to.
is
Not
that too
required.
much power to give to a public adjuster? And how do you know when to draw those lines? Like, I think these are great conversations because if a public adjuster came to me and was like, hey, I want a power of attorney so I can sign your name and deposit
You
this
might
check,
have some hesitation.
I might have hesitation.
I'd
But
hesitate,
But
yeah.
if that is something that's fairly standard and there's a reason behind that, then okay, I could understand.
So it was in my contract, and even I would be real hesitant to sign something like that. So I get the hesitation on it. We never forced anybody to sign that portion of it. The benefit being this was a loss draft, a check that had to be physically signed. So we could drive over to your house 2-3 hours away, try to schedule a time, maybe meet you at your business, something along those lines. Or if it was just more convenient for you, we could just sign off on it because you've given us permission to do that kind of thing. But we are required to tell you that we got it and what it is, everything that's there. Can't just do it willy-nilly. So there are bad apples in every field though, and I can tell you I know of public adjusters that have committed some form of fraud, but most of the time they were not given a power of attorney and they just signed the policyholder's name anyway. So it was forgery that led to fraudulent activity. or the contract was definitely not written properly or didn't exist at all, and they were still trying to act on behalf of the policyholder as a public adjuster. I've heard of one contractor, or not a contractor, a public adjuster that had a contract that was a public adjuster contract, an appraisal contract. There was several more possible hats that they could transfer back and forth on depending on what the situation deemed, and they got to make that choice at any given time.
Oh, wow.
Every time it transferred to a different type of hat, different fees were accumulated. By the time it was all said and done, he might be collecting like 70% of the insurance check.
Wow.
So
Now-
there's that kind of stuff. If you've got a public adjuster contract that's 7 pages long, that's a red flag.
You should probably
should
consider
run.
that might be a problem.
Yeah. Now, are public adjusters good appraisers? Some.
What's
Yes
an-
and no. I mean, so have you guys gone over appraisal at all?
We did. We talked about it a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, so if you know what an appraiser is, then there's no real license for this. There might be some certifications that you can get and things, but for most states, you just have to be considered competent and disinterested, or possibly unbiased.
And there's no real definition of what that competent is.
So courts across the U.S. have defined parts of this. They've defined whether someone that is getting a percentage of the amount that gets approved is interested. And most of them have said yes. So what is disinterested, what is biased or unbiased, they've defined those things. They haven't really defined the competent side.
Right.
So, engineers are supposed to act on something that they're competent in, and for most states, they're allowed to determine if they're competent. They could be challenged as experts in court with a Daubert challenge or something, but otherwise, they have to determine themselves if they're competent. So if you're hiring an appraiser, you might want to find out if they really are by asking questions like, have you ever taken a class on this? How long have you ever done work on a roof if it's a roof claim? Have you ever performed a roof job yourself? Have you ever been a roofing contractor? How do you know how to estimate properly for this kind of work?
Now-
Those kinds of questions.
Now, doesn't it, we talked a little bit earlier about negotiating on behalf of and fiduciary. Now, from an appraisal standpoint, are they negotiating on behalf, or they're just giving? So it starts to get a little bit tricky, and that's why I wonder.
Fuzzy.
And does an appraiser have to be a public adjuster?
No, they don't have to be a public adjuster.
So would you say it's
I'm
more
aware of it in
important
the state.
for an appraiser to have, let's just say we're talking about a roof claim, right?
Right.
Would you say that it was more important that maybe they've been a roofing contractor and understand what goes into that process than to have been a public adjuster?
I do, because the appraisal process isn't supposed to include, for most states, generally speaking, it doesn't include differences of coverages. So there isn't a coverage argument anymore. So there's not a policy argument anymore. So you'd rather have somebody that knew how that work was supposed to be performed. I think they would be much more competent for that scenario than a public adjuster would be. I don't
Okay,
think the
That
PA
makes
is
a
the
lot
right
of
move.
sense.
That
Thank you.
makes
This
perfect
is
sense.
not someone that is negotiating on your behalf either, though. This is supposed to be a third party that's performing a third party act, and they're going to get together and they're going to determine what the amount of loss is. Your insurance company's not supposed to have any say anymore. You don't have any say anymore. This is just a way of avoiding going to court. As an alternative dispute resolution, you've got this third party process, and the guy that you pick is competent,
Right.
disinterested, unbiased. They're supposed to figure it out.
So a policyholder, a homeowner, could go straight out and find their own appraiser, or do they have to go through a public adjuster to find an appraiser?
You can find your own appraiser.
It's
Just
not
like you can find your
necessarily
own
a step by
contractor.
step.
Right.
This
A lot of
happened.
public adjusters know good appraisers and might recommend some people
Right,
to.
that's
so you
what I
don't
was
have to
getting
go
at.
looking.
Okay.
A lot of contractors might know good appraisers too.
Okay.
A lot of attorneys know good appraisers. So
And Nappia would be another place, or the Appia places would be another place.
possibly there are appraisal organizations that you could go to. The Plan Network, Appraiser and Umpire Association, the IAEA, the Insurance Appraisal and Umpire Association. That's 3. There's a lot of those out there. Just look for appraisal associations. You might find those lists.
I have one more question I want to circle back to, and I apologize we didn't get to this when you were actually kind of talking about it, but with a public adjuster, I think one of the common things that I hear from homeowners, they don't understand all these numbers that are on their policy. What does this mean? What does this mean? It's real easy, I think, to look at your policy and say, for me as a policyholder myself, I can look at my policy and I can say, okay, well, it says my dwelling is insured for this much. That makes sense to me because that's, how much it might cost to replace my full house if it burned down. But there's so many other numbers on that. Should people, obviously it seems to me they should be asking questions about what each of those mean, because in the end that could make a lot of difference.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And they would ask that of a public adjuster, correct?
I would hope they would ask this of their agent as they're getting the policy, but in the event of a loss and you haven't done that already, then yeah, asking a public adjuster this kind of thing is a good idea. Some of those numbers are going to be completely meaningless until you get into the policy language and it starts talking about it. And there's going to be categories for things that mean something that's very different from one policy to the next. Policies used to be really, really similar. 20 years ago, most policies were very, very close to a nationally recognized ISO form from the Insurance Services Office, ISO. And those policies would be very, very similar to that. And now they're wildly different from one to the next, and they don't really match this framework anymore. Most agents that are out there are still selling this framework because they haven't really dug through the policy language themselves. They know that they're selling an RCV policy. Well, one RCV policy to the next is not the same.
And if you're not sure what an RCV policy is, again, we did discuss that in an episode with Vince Perry. So just make sure that you go back, and that's why it's important that you kind of watch all of them.
All of these.
Because they intertwine, and I don't want you to be confused or miss anything. Mm-hmm. So, just to kind of sum it up, it's really clear to me why it's necessary to have public adjusters and why it's necessary for consumers to know what a public adjuster does. They are an advocate for the consumer. They can discuss the policy. They can explain their policy to them. They can advocate for them. They can have those, pearl conversations. I'm just kidding. Pearl conversations with insurance companies on behalf of the consumer. And I think that, a lot of people may be shy about or think it's not something that they need to pay for, so to speak. And obviously it is their choice, but you're also talking about a small fee in comparison to a claim being denied or approved.
I mean, yeah, more often than not, public adjusters are adding so much value. They more than compensate for their own fees. And if they don't, or if they're not able to, they should tell you that up front. But there's no guarantees that anything that you do, getting a PA involved is actually very low risk, simply because most of the time it's on a contingency basis,
right,
depending on what state you're in.
And I've heard different situations where my customers have said, my insurance company told me not to hire a public adjuster.
Yeah, they do that
because it's going to just make this so much harder, and now all of these different things kick in. And there is, and I've experienced it. It does sometimes add length of time. Because there's a different level of conversations that are happening, and you should expect that if you hire a public adjuster or go to appraisal, that process is going to now be lengthened, and it could be up to, I've seen it be as much as a year to 2 years. Doesn't always happen that way. That's kind of worst case scenario, but you do need to be prepared for that. But all in all, it becomes your personal choice. Again, I've seen public adjusters add a lot of value consistently when necessary on a claim, and I think that this was really great education to provide. So thank you for being here. We really appreciate it, Matt.
You're welcome.
And make sure, if you want to learn more about Matt or what his podcast and some of this stuff that he talks about, Listen to This Bull is on YouTube. Thanks, guys.
Got a lot of bull to talk about.